I'm here to talk about The Phantom Carriage. The Phantom Carriage is a Swedish film released in 1921 about a man who becomes the driver to death's carriage, reaping souls to bring them to the afterlife. And it goes hard. This film is the beating heart of horror in cinema. It's got everything. Ghosts, freaky imagery, psycho husband, and even a door getting broken down by an axe. What more could you want? Okay, so let's get into the analysis here. So this film opens up with a poor woman. She's diseased with pneumonia. She's diseased with pneumonia, but it has a P, so I always end up pronouncing it when I'm reading it off the script. Almost certainly to die the next evening, and not just any evening, but as the film puts it, the eerie night of New Year's Eve. She calls out for a man named David Holm to come to her, and her friends agree to search for him. So, lady's here dying, sends her friends out to go get David Holm, who we know nothing about. We then cut to this group of 3 drunken buddies, and they're just chatting. They're happy, getting a little drunk by a graveyard. It's New Year's Eve. What can you expect? And one of this eerie environment of the cemetery where they're chilling at reminds one of them of a story that from a couple years back. Some old man showed up and told him and his friends this freaky tale about the Phantom Carriage. So this man starts telling the story of Death's Carriage. And Death's Carriage is a carriage that goes around and reaps the souls of dead people, putting them in the carriage and then eventually bringing them to the afterlife. And we get this really cool sequence of Death picking up souls and putting him in his carriage after a terrible fate. There's a sick quote from this. Though horse and carriage are always the same, the driver is not. The last soul to die each year, the one who passes over at the stroke of midnight, is destined to be Death's driver for the following year. The man recalls that the person who told him this story happened to die on midnight last year. The man is no other than David Holm, if you haven't guessed already, and some friends catch up to him and say, "Hey, this lady's looking for you. Will you please come say hi, as she's going to probably die tonight?" And he goes, "No, I'm not gonna." And they're like, "Please." And he says, "No, I'm not gonna." And this pisses off his 2 drunk friends, who end up getting in a little quarrel. They get in a little fight. One eventually ends up breaking a bottle over David Holmes' head, which kills him. Maybe it's a heart attack or something, but it's a little smack and then he's dead. We know he's dead because the death carriage itself rolls into town, and the man gets off of his carriage and goes to sit by David Holm as David Holm's spirit comes out of his body. So the man who gets off the carriage happens to be the man that was telling the story from the story that David was telling his bros. And he says, "How ironic that it's you, because I told you this story once." And he says, "How ironic is what?" And he says, "You have to be Death's driver for the following year, since you are the last person to die this year." And he says, "No way, Jose." And the Death's current driver sits down next to David Holmes' dead body with David Holmes' spirit, and they start chatting about all of David Holmes' past life leading up to this moment. The whole like middle of this film reminds you a lot of A Christmas Carol, but really dark, because this dude was like coughing on children, his own children. And he wasn't very cool. So David did not lead a happy life, which we see in this next few sequences, treating strangers, children, and his wife poorly and selfishly. The woman made David promise that he would come back the following year, which happens to be right now, to tell him how his year was, because she had hoped him a good year. But he refused to come see her, and now he's dead. I'm choosing not to spoil the end of this film, because I was sitting up, like, invested in this movie at the end of it. And this film has amazing storytelling, and I highly recommend it. So If you're at all interested in horror movies or a psychological thriller, this 1921 film, like, it's up there, man. Highly recommend. Put it on your films to watch list. So The Phantom Carriage was one of the pioneers in creating the visual language of movies. Unlike most other long-form films at the time, they were kind of like stage plays, they were being filmed. This movie used camera techniques that enhanced emotions and strengthened the narrative. There's a few shots where the frame shrinks down to hold on to a single character or shows different angles of the same place, which was kind of new. Another insane thing this movie had going for it was that it told its story in a non-linear fashion. Somewhat controversially, some of the story is told by flashbacks taking place inside of a flashback, like Christopher Nolan's Inception style. Another thing this movie's probably known for is how it portrays the dead, with the brand new double exposure technique. It uses this effect commonly throughout the film, most notably when a being's soul is being reaped and we watch the person come out of its body after the killer line, "Captive, come forth from thy prison." The Phantom Carriage used this technique impeccably, as ghostly images are a vital part of this film's story. So there are plenty of shots that modern films continue to seem to copy from this Phantom Carriage movie. Perhaps the most obvious is the scene when David breaks down a bathroom door with an axe, which is really comparable to The Shining when you put them side by side. And one can't help but wonder if Stanley Kubrick took that from the Phantom Carriage. Another thing worth mentioning is that the director, who has a really cool Swedish name that I wish I could pronounce, but I can't, so I'll put it on screen, was very politically aware. It said that his 1913 movie, Ingborg Holm, which follows a widow and her children struggling to survive on the streets of Sweden, has direct correlations to a large change in Sweden's poor relief laws after it came out. So, final thing is I wanted to talk about the Phantom Carriage's influence in horror. The Phantom Carriage was released in the same 3 years as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, and follows plenty of the same characteristics of the German films, with dark shadows and twisting angles, kind of that expressionistic style we talked about in class. I think the psychological aspect of this film really puts it above other movies I've seen, especially one from 1921 that I wouldn't have expected anything in that caliber. We get to follow David Holm and his regretful emotions throughout his life very closely, and it is a very emotionally tragic movie, and that really shines through. It's worth mentioning how death is portrayed in this movie, as it hasn't really changed much since. Death carries a sickle and a triangular hood, which has been characteristics of Death since he was first introduced into art. Even the most recent-ish form of Death in cinema, from Puss in Boots to The Last Wish, wears this same triangular hood and carries scythes. They are both portrayed as mature men and react coolly and precisely with a mission to uphold, and that hasn't really changed since this movie came out, and I think that is really impressive for the director to portray a character in such a way that it is still around today. Finally, to close up, in an article about The Phantom Carriage from Pop Matters, the author says that The Phantom Carriage can be rightfully considered as one of the most important films from the silent era. And I completely, totally agree. This film was fantastic.